All right, everyone. So I'm a big Resident Evil fan, and I've played all the main series games now, um, all the way from the very first one to Requiem, and now I want to put them into a tier list, and kind of talk through my thoughts and see how they shake out. This isn't going to be a very formal video or anything. I'm just gonna say what I think and you know just explain why I think the games rank where they do, and just try and have some fun with it. So I'm gonna get started. I'm actually not going to use the D tier uh, because no game on this list is going to rank below C. And I'm also not going to rank every game in this list. I haven't played a lot of these side games, but I have played some of them, so I will rank the ones that I have played. Um, so to explain what the tiers are, S, let's see, S will say masterpiece. A will say excellent game. B will say good. And C will say flawed. Yeah. Flawed. I don't know if I want to say flawed. I don't think that's really a fair accounting of how I feel. Um, I'm just gonna say could be better. All right. So I'm just gonna go in the order the list gave me. I guess ranking the remakes right after their originals is gonna be kind of weird, but I don't really have a problem doing that. Um, so first off on the list, we got the original Resident Evil game, which I'm going to put in the A tier. So this is the one that started us all, and it's great. Like not the first. So full disclosure, the first Resident Evil game I played was Resident Evil 5. Um, so I didn't get the introduction to the series in the survival horror fixed camera angle original games. Um, those came I played them much more recently. I just actually did a full series marathon before Requiem came out, but I had played most of the originals years ago, but still after some of the more they're not recent anymore uh action variants of the games. So I think I first played Resident Evil 1 probably 5-ish years ago, and I had already known a lot about it. So, but it was my first introduction into the fixed camera angle. Well, actually, no, that's not true. The remake was. Um, but this was the first of the original games that I played. And I think even today it holds up quite well. The puzzles are strong. The mansion design is great. Spencer Mansion is still one of my favorite places in Resident Evil to explore. Um, the guest house is also very good. The caves I don't like as much. They're just too boring, and they have a lot of hunters in there. I guess I'll talk about enemies in a minute. And the lab's good. Lots of labs in Resident Evil games. But I think the lab in Resident Evil 1 is pretty solid. So in terms of like design and environments and map design, I think it's very good. Gameplay wise, it's great. I like it a lot. Like I said, this is contingent on how you feel about tank controls, and I am comfortable with them. A lot of people aren't, but they're not hard once you know what you're doing. So it plays well. You get a decent variety of weapons. Um, Basic, but you get the pistol, the knife, which I never use, and then the shotgun is my favorite. Um, so it's all good there. Um, Difficulty wise, I think it's not too difficult. I've played harder games for sure in the series. It just in the early games when you have to be more conservative how much you save, it can be a little difficult there and losing some progress. Um, the only real negative I have to say about the game is the voice acting, which I know we all love it now because it's like iconic lines and it's real cheesy and we love it that way. But like if we're looking at it from like an actual performance perspective, they aren't good. I mean, I don't think the writing, and I guess this is going to be a theme across all the games that the writing isn't great. Um, I mean, like story wise, it's fine, but the actual performances are quite silly. And I like them, but like if we're talking about the quality, they're not high. So and that's really the only real negative I have in this game. So I mean, there's only one reason I'm not putting this game in the S tier, and it's because I'm putting Resident Evil Remake in the S tier. Because this game basically everything I said before applies, but they just make it better. They add Lisa Trevor, they add the other areas like the graveyard and uh the the before you get to the lab, the underground where Lisa Trevor is. Um, yeah, they add the defensive items, which actually are very helpful because they also added Crimson Heads, which make the game quite a bit more difficult and strategic when killing zombies. Not only do we have to decide, am I gonna kill these zombies, but if I do I have enough resources to come back with um, fuel can to kill them? Um, so yeah, they make improvements on the maps and the puzzles are remixed. So if you've played the original, it's not playing the same game. Like, and you'll see this is a theme throughout the remakes. They remix enough stuff that it actually feels pretty good to replay, um, even if you just play the original. Because like broad strokes, yes, this is essentially the first game, but the new areas, the improved performances, acting wise, um, the game looks great even still today, and it's over 20 years old now. Just it's a real great improvement on a game that was already very strong. Um, I didn't talk about this before, but the horror aspect, um, I think it's scarier because of things like Crimson Heads. Um, but and this might I don't find Resident Evil games in general very scary. There's exceptions, but for the most part, I don't find them that scary, especially the older games, just because uh they're dated at this point. So I mean, I'm comparing them against some of the later games on this list that look, more visceral and realistic. Um, and they just have a much wider range of things that they can make to seem scary compared to what they could do in the 90s. So um, there's that. Uh, so I think in terms of scariness, though, I think Resident Evil Remake is fairly scary, scarier than the original. Um, and yeah, like I said, better in every way, basically. So that's it's. I don't know if it is my favorite Resident Evil game. When I'm done, I can kind of take a look and maybe rank them within tiers. But for now, I'm just gonna leave it there. It's definitely like in my top five easily, maybe probably top three. Next up, we got the original Resident Evil 2. Will also be an S tier game. So comparing Resident Evil 2 to the original Resident Evil game, um, it takes everything that worked there and just expands it even more. So we got the RPD as our main set piece location, and it's just so iconic and so well designed. Um, like everywhere you go, there's something interesting to look at. No, there's not like a boring room. Like in the original Resident Evil games, um, the original Resident Evil game, some of the rooms in the mansion aren't necessarily, they're just mansion rooms. Not a lot really to unpack there. But in Resident Evil 2, we have a police station, but that also used to be an art museum. So everything there is quite, they're just, they have the rooms that you can tell this used to be an art museum. The huge library in there, and then, the rooms that the cells in the bottom, the parking garage, there's a lot to love about that um, design. Then we have the sewers, which are um, fine, I guess. I don't love them. They're maybe the weak point of the game, I suppose. Um, but they're not that bad though. Like they're inoffensive. I'll say that. Like I said, they're sewers. There's not much interesting to put there. Um, After the sewers, we had the factory, which is basically in one area for a boss fight. Fine, but it is pretty iconic. The elevator with the train car on it. It's pretty iconic and throughout the series. So I mean, it's a nice area and there's a good boss fight there. And then the lab's nest is a good lab. Yeah, I'd say it's an improvement on the original's lab. I would say so. I mean, it's also just super iconic, right? Um, and it's not too long, not drawn out like some of the labs later in the series tend to be. Um, you do what you got to do there. There's enough interesting enemies in there. Enemies are great in Resident Evil 2. The liquors are iconic. Um, uh, the plant monsters, I forget if they what their real name is. They're very interesting to see. Um, are there dogs in Resident Evil 2? I don't think there's dogs in Resident Evil 2. No, there is. They're in the basement. Um, you always gotta have the zombie dogs. Um, and of course the zombies. And then we get into the boss enemies, which are pretty good. But Birkin and all his stages are great to go through. Mr. X, when you fight him, is good. And his stalking segments are great. I'll talk more about stalking when I get to Resident Evil 3. Um, Story wise, so we got the improvement. No, so the performances are not great still. Um, I'm not going to harp on them too much because for all the original trilogy games are not great, but two at least I care a little bit more about it because there's more like interactions between there's more characters, right? So in the first game, in a given scenario, you have the player character Chris or Jill, their partner Barry or Rebecca, and then Wesker, and he's not in the game that much. So essentially, we're going between like two people, and then like the random Bravo team members that die. There's just not a lot of character interaction. What we get is either very funny in a cheesy way, in a cheesy and unintentional way, or just like one and off interactions that end. Now in two, the interactions are more substantial, right? Leon with Ada, which is one of the best pairings in the series, and Claire and Sherry, which is a good develops Claire well, and Sherry's an interesting character for her place in things. Um, Throughout the series. So, um, and then the enemies are great. Birkin, even though we don't see a lot of him, William Birkin, I should say, we don't see a lot of him in his human form. We do get enough backstory and information through files and how people talk about him to kind of get a gauge of what kind of person he is and why he's a good villain. Brian Irons is very a bit over the top, even by Resident Evil standards, but I do like what he brings to the story as the evil cop. And then Annette, her characterization is fine. I think she's definitely better here than in the remake, but we'll talk more about the remake in a second. I don't find this game as scary, but I think it just plays a lot better, right? Since we have the two characters in Resident Evil 1, Jill and Chris, don't really have big differences between them. Like, they don't get different weapons. I think the only difference is the lockpick, and I guess for Jill and Chris just can't do some things. It's there's some small minor differences, but they're essentially the same. Uh, Claire and Leon, two player characters in Resident Evil 2, are I think mechanically the same. Like I don't think they do this thing where Chris is bulkier but has a smaller inventory. They don't do that. They're here. Um, but what they do is they give them access to different weapons, which makes playing each character feel different and you know in a much more interesting way than I think the first game does. Um, the zapping system works very well. because what that is uh, if you pick up items in one scenario, they won't be available in the other scenario. So it's a little bit strategic between runs and increases replayability. And these A and B scenarios in Resident Evil 2 really make it feel like they all come together in one way where Resident Evil's canon is very loose to begin with, but being able to see the story from different orders and sides just makes it more interesting that way. Um, and adds to replayability, and it's just really good. Like it's Resident Evil 2 is just fantastic. The original game is hard to say anything wrong with it. Um, the remake, however, is also great. Um, it's really fun. So we get the updated action gameplay, third person over the shoulder, which is become the standard since RE4, and uh, but I think so. What this is I think it's a faithful recreation of RE2 for the most part, and with some improvements to be sure, but then also some things that don't like as much. We'll start with things that I think are improved. I think the level design is, as I mean, I don't know if I'd say it's better, but they change enough that it feels fresh, right? RPD is different. I do think the sewers in RE2 Remake are better than in the original game. Like, that's just full stop. They add new enemies that weren't present in Resident Evil 2 Original. They change the puzzle up a little bit, and I think that's very good. Um, Game plays wonderfully because every game that's made in the RE engine, so that's all the games starting with Resident Evil 7, um, just play very good. Play very good. They're like they feel good to play. The combat's great. Um, Game looks great. So I mean that part I guess is improved. I mean tank controls are a stylistic choice I think, and for a game from the 90s that's much slower paced than a game that came out in 2019, it works for what it does. But obviously for Resident Evil 2, what works very well is the controls that they do have. Performances are great, right? Obviously they've come a long way in voice acting and character portrayals. Although I do think so, I guess this is a good pivot to things I don't like. Some of the portrayals are a little off to me. Um, well, okay, I guess just Annette Birkin. They kind of make her like really bad, and I know that she's not like a good guy in the original game, but I don't know the way she seems to almost disregard Sherry's safety, which I don't think was present in the original game. It just seems so just like I understand like she's not a good character, a good guy, but it irks me a little bit. Um, I don't like Ada's introduction where she tells Leon she's an FBI agent. I mean, like it does clear some confusion as to why, because in the original game she just says she's looking for a boyfriend, which you know doesn't really give her any insight to why she might be able to be so proficient and capable in these combat scenarios with guns and such. Um, so narratively that makes sense, but I don't know. It just I liked the reveal, and this might be with hindsight. I don't know how it would have been if I didn't know Ada already was a spy. Um, so I mean that portrayal is not as bad as Annette's to me, but it's interesting. Some things I do like about how Ada's portrayed in this game though is that she is like a little bit more evil. And like I know I just like talked badly about Annette for being like more evil, but like it works for Ada, I think, because you know she's always been stringing Leon along. Like even the kiss from the original, because she in the original Resident Evil 2, she kisses Leon, and she also kisses Leon in this game, but it's completely recontextualized, right? Because in the original game, she does it as she's dying, um, and after that, Leon thinks she's gone, right? But in the remake, she is this is before the lab. They even get to the lab, and she does it. She's still stringing Leon along, but she this is like Ada's through line throughout the series is that like there's probably some genuine feelings inside for Leon, but she is at the end of the day using him for her goals with whatever work she's doing. Um, and I think this game really kind of makes her feel a little bit more, you know, evil. I'll just say evil than she does in the original game and even in RE4 and 6. So, I mean, I like that portrayal. I like Ada being much more gray than a lot of people want to probably give her credit for. I mean, she's just a great character in this series. And I'm glad that she is still here and improved. Um, but yeah, so the main thing keeping me from putting the remake of Resident Evil 2 in the S tier, I think, is how they handled the A and B scenarios, where they just don't exist. The zapping system is gone, and the A and B scenarios are now just like your first run and your second run. And like, there's no real differences between like in the first game, Leon A and Leon B were very different scenarios. In the second game, and same thing with Claire scenarios, Claire A, Claire B were very different scenarios. In this game, Claire first, Claire second, and Leon first, Leon second don't change much of anything at all. And almost objectively, the second run is just kind of worse. Um, it cuts some stuff out and kind of streamlines some stuff because it assumes you already saw it in the first run, which you did, but I don't know. I don't like that they streamlined it. You know, just let us play through some of the stuff that we might have already seen. Um, there's also some weird inconsistencies in the story, which, once again, Resident Evil canon is very loose, so I'm not going to harp on it too much, but, like, some puzzles are done multiple times, some bosses are fought multiple times. It doesn't really make sense that they would be. So it's purely to serve the gameplay, but at the expense of the narrative, which I think is acceptable a lot of times, but for here it bothers me. And that's probably my biggest bother with Resident Evil 2 Remake and why I think it's a really, really a great game. Just not one of the top tier games that we've seen in the Resident Evil series. Alright, next on the list we got Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, also an S tier game. Um, so Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a much more it's a more innovative than Resident Evil 2 is even, which is surprising to me because Resident Evil 2 really expanded on a lot of what Resident Evil did, but our Resident Evil 3 Nemesis just went even further. Um what it did was so it's a lot more action oriented than I think the first two games. It has like well, Nemesis is the I guess we'll just talk about Nemesis. Nemesis is the big thing here, right? He's the stalker, the first. I'm gonna say the first stalker because I don't think Mr. X in the original Resident Evil 2 works so much as a stalker, more as a roadblock. He in the remake, I didn't touch on this, but Mr. X in the remake of Resident Evil 2 is a stalker. he follows you throughout the entire RPD. In the original game, I'm pretty sure he only pops out in certain scripted areas, which he might follow you for that room, but he's not going to pursue you in the way that he does in Resident Evil 2, and certainly not the way that Nemesis does in Resident Evil 3. Um, in Resident Evil 3, Nemesis is just just one of the best executions of a stalker in the series, and he was like the first real one, which is saying a lot considering how much they work with the stalker formula and prefer their entries. Um, so yeah, Nemesis will pursue you around Raccoon City, pretty relentlessly, right? And you can either choose to engage him, which you are rewarded for if you knock him down, or if you choose to avoid him, like I generally do, because ammo's precious, and I don't want to use it on something that can't really be killed. Um, I I think it's exhilarating, and I do think it's scary in the sense that it gets my blood going, and I'm always on the lookout when I hear the boom boom in the background. You know he's here, you know he's coming, and you have to be ready and ready to run and ready to fight. Um, that's something that hasn't quite been replicated in any Resident Evil game. None of them, which is kind of crazy to me. Um, the map in this game is actually quite expansive, right? So you get Raccoon City as your first major set piece, and it's got a lot going on, and you go over a wide area in a lot of places. Um, and it's just great to see the city as it's burning down, and all the areas that you can go to. It feels it's not an open world, but it feels so much more open than something like RPD or the Spencer Mansion. Um, it's really a treat to explore. And then you go to the clock tower and the park, which are another just great areas, more enclosed, more classic. Well, this is a classic game, but more like the first two games of these enclosed, smaller areas where you have to move through carefully and watch out for things. But Nemesis is still in these areas, the clock tower, anyways. Um, and it's the peak classic map design, I think, in this game. Um, Enemy wise, we've got a lot going on here. We've got Nemesis himself, obviously. Um, we've got zombies. We've got what are they? The large insects. I forget what we call them officially, but they're here. Um, there's the hunters that are, I forget what they're called off the top of my head, but those hunters too in the hospital. Um, and a few bosses that we have Nemesis fights a couple times, which are great. And then the is a Gravedigger and the Giant Worm. He's a fun one too. Weapon variety in this game is very good. We get um just a lot of weapons, and this also is the first game to have ammo crafting, which is a nice little addition because it lets you're gonna need some more ammo in this game than you were gonna need in the first two. And the fact that you can choose to make the type of ammo that you want to make, handgun ammo, shotgun ammo, or grenade launcher ammo, it lets you tailor your experience a little bit more to how you want to play the game, and I think that's nice. Um, Performances are still, this is the last game where the performances are truly abysmal, but they're not great. But story wise, I think this is one of the more self-contained stories in the series. I mean, now it does have implications for things later on, but it's it's just Jill escaping Raccoon City. She meets Carlos Oliveira, who's a good character, like just a nice good guy, and then Nikolai, the evil umbrella captain, is a great villain. He works well as the main villain here, um, to give a face to someone we should be worried about other than Nemesis. Um, and the choice system in this game, I forget what the decision, live selection, I forget what they call it, but like this is the only game that does this in the entire. Well, there's choices in other games, but like multiple times you're going to being given the option to do two things, and they have different outcomes. Um, Other than one near the end, they don't affect things super majorly, but they might like give you extra items depending on how you handle Nemesis, or just generally different. Uh, I believe one of them affects the Nemesis boss fight even at the clock tower, depending on what you choose on the train. So I am surprised that this didn't catch on for other games, because it was a nice little thing, and it really gives the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis another unique identity that no other game really has. Um, so I really appreciate RE3 Nemesis for being unique in a lot of ways, and it executed very well. The control wise, which are more updated controls. I think this is the first game with quick turn, and you can dodge. Like there's the movement abilities have improved. This is where we start seeing Resident Evil, innovating rather than just iterating, and it's 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 amazing to see. Definitely one of the best games in the series. And because it's so good, it really hurts that the remake is um hmm, this is tough for me. I'm gonna set it in good for now and see how I feel about it a little bit. But Resident Evil 3 Remake is such a disappointing game because, and it's not a bad game. Let's get that out of the way. It does do some good things. I think performances are obviously better, and it gives Carlos a lot more playtime than he'd had in the original game. We get a visit to the RPD in addition to playing most of the hospital segment, which is very nice to add to the game and kind of tie it into our Resident Evil 2 a little bit more. Um, and it's um, obviously it looks gorgeous, plays well. Though, what else do I like about it before I start railing into it? Uh, some of the new areas are pretty nice. I think Nest 2 is alright. The new final area. It's ending in a lab, which kind of is a disappointment because the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis doesn't end in a lab, it ends in a factory, so it's a little different. Um, and then we're just back to the lab thing, which every Resident Evil game ends at a lab, it feels like. Um, but I don't think Nest 2 is that bad of a area in the game. I mean, it's got things going for it. At the very least, it's inoffensive. Um, okay, I guess I'm just gonna start talking about things I don't like now because I'm struggling to think of things that are really great about it. Um, Nemesis doesn't stalk in the same way. We have some good scripted Nemesis battles that aren't in the first game, and they are good. Nemesis with the flamethrower, Nemesis at the clock tower, but not in the same way that we fight him in the original game at the clock tower. These are good fights. He's very imposing and menacing, just as he always is, but he doesn't stalk. He he is more regulated to the role that Mr. X plays in the original Resident Evil 2, where he shows up in certain areas and stalks you for those particular areas, but he won't follow you from one area to the next. And that's just a complete downgrade of what made Nemesis so special in the original game. Not only that, but they've compacted the Raccoon City streets portion of the game so much that in a game that's already short, that it just feels like we are there too briefly, and it doesn't feel expansive like it did in the original game. It just feels like you're walking through and then we're moving on. Um, and that really is sad because that was the best part of the original game. But I mean, the game plays well. It's not a bad game. It's a really good game story wise. Well, okay, a really good game. Uh, I'm gonna leave it in good. I'm gonna leave it in the B tier. I think it's a good game. I think it plays well, and I think if you're not constantly comparing it to the original game, there's a lot to enjoy there. But if you have played the original game, and I'm also not saying that every remake needs to be super faithful to the original game. Like I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't mind that the clock tower and the parks aren't in the remake the way that they are in the original. I think it's okay to change things up quite dramatically in a remake because I don't want to just play the same game again. Like like the original Resident Evil remake does is pretty close to the original game, but it does add quite enough things that it does separate itself. It needs those different things. I just don't want another game that looks better, sounds better, but otherwise isn't the same. That's why Resident Evil 2 is very successful. It changes quite a bit. Not everything for the better, but it does make changes that I do like. Um, Resident Evil 3 makes changes, but they're almost all worse. It's just strange because clearly they know it's a beloved game, and I really do think they tried to put together the best game that they could. It just not everything can be excellent or a masterpiece, and unfortunately, Resident Evil 3 just isn't one of those games. Next up on our list, we have Resident Evil Code Veronica. Um, so Code Veronica, I'm the next two games, Code Veronica and Resident Evil Zero. These are sort of looked at as the black sheep of the main series Resident Evil games. And yes, Code Veronica is a main series Resident Evil game. Um, for a lot of reasons, and I'm gonna engage with them. I'm going to address those criticisms, but Resident Evil Code Veronica is easily an A tier Resident Evil game. Um, so what do we have here? So this is still a classic style Resident Evil game that's not a remake, but they finally have gotten pretty good voice acting. Um, I do think Steve Burnside's performance is painful, but and he is a prominent character in the game. But other than that, Claire and Chris work very well. I do love Alfred and Alexia and how hammy and evil they are, and their performances are, and Wesker is the same. Um, all of that's very good, and the story here is actually quite interesting, right? Claire getting caught after looking for Chris and getting sent to this prison island, um, where we really learn more about the deeper net of people that are associated with Umbrella outside of Raccoon City, right? We get to see the Ashford family and a little bit more backstory on how Umbrella came to be, which we don't get as much of in the original games. So expanding Umbrella's lore is great, while giving us great new villains to look into, and it's always the villains, right? Burnside, Steve Burnside doesn't. I don't hate the character. I think he's fine. He's just the performance is whiny, and he's a kid and he acts like a kid, so I can understand why that's grating. But one performance that I don't particularly love among all the other ones, which I do, that's that's fine. As for the game itself, um, it feels like a classic Resident Evil game, but you feel a little more free. I believe the camera, it's still fixed camera angles, but it just feels. This could just be my perception, but it feels like maybe the field of view is wider. It feels like you can see more, um, and it looks better too, as it's a new generation of gaming, and that we're not on the PlayStation 1 anymore. So the game looks great. Um, so the game looks great and it sounds great, and we're on to the map design, which is, I'd say it's fine. I'd say map design is fine. Rockford Island is fine. I like the mansion. I mean, I'm a sucker for the mansions in this game. Um, is good, and the actual like island part is fine. I don't really like the training center military building. It seems kind of samey to me. The Antarctica base in the second half of the game is much better, other than the Moth Room. And if you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. It's the hallway in Antarctica where you can't seem to get past without getting caught by a moth, and they respawn. It's dreadful, absolutely terrible. But other than that, it's a very good base there too. Um, so good, fine map design. I think it's fine. Um, with one or two kind of gripes, but other than that, it's fine. Enemies are interesting because we've got some pretty decent boss fights, but we also have some horrendous standard enemies. The Bandersnatches are horrendous. What they essentially, their gimmick is they have a long arm and they can reach and grab you. But they do this from off screen, and it's you don't even have a chance to react to them before they grab you. I did not like them. Not the worst enemy in the series, but it's a very annoying one. Um, but for the boss fights, we have a Tyrant, which we love Tyrants. I always love a Tyrant boss fight. Nosferatu, which is a very scary boss. This one is scary. Um, just his design and his whole vibe. Um, it's another giant worm in this game. Um, I don't have anything particularly to say about him. He's fine, I guess. And then, uh, is it Alexia herself? I'm not gonna count the Steve fight because it's not really a fight. Which is also another annoying point in the game that I'll talk about. Um, but the Alexia fight is fine. I do like the boss fights. Um, in this game, so enemies are mostly fine. Um, for things that I don't particularly, so let's address the common concerns that midway through the game you switch from playing as Clara to playing as Chris, and it's possible to leave your items in Claire's inventory, and Chris won't have access to them if you didn't put them in the item box, which the game doesn't do a good job of warning you of. This is bad game design, and it is unacceptable. Um, there's no way around, saying that. Um, there's also the issue of soft locking yourself in the tyrant fight if you didn't come properly equipped to fight the tyrant, which I'm less mad at the game about, because I mean they do have the anti BOW grenades, which help a lot in that fight, but they don't, once again, don't do a great job of telling you to bring those. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, Resident Evil games have always kind of been about inventory management. So like, if you got to that point and you didn't have anything and you didn't have a save, recent enough to go back and maybe try and find something, I think that's a little bit on you. I don't think that's as bad as the not being able to transfer the inventory over. That just seems like, it's a tough fight, and you should be keeping multiple save files open, I think. I think that's always been my philosophy in Resident Evil games. So I'm not too angry about that. I am angry about the metal detector item boxes. Those are kind of weird and very easy to forget. And if you forget the fire extinguisher in one of those, you don't get access to the Magnum later in Antarctica. That's bad game design. So, those are the main complaints. Some people say the game's quite hard because of that, but yeah, I guess it'll be hard if you lose half your inventory. But assuming you are able to keep everything together, I don't think the game's that hard. It's certainly not harder than Resident Evil Zero. Um, so yeah, do I think if those problems didn't exist, would the game be S tier? I'd still say no. I still think the game is strong. Strong classic map design, strong classic gameplay and inventory management. Um, strong story, I think, and characters. I just think the reason this game doesn't rise above, I think, is because it doesn't have too many iconic moments or areas, right? Like Rockford Island and the Antarctic base they're cool. I like them. But, they don't measure up to RPD. They don't measure up to Spencer Mansion. It's not Raccoon City Streets. It's just not it's not to that level. Um, so and like the enemies, like I said, there are some decent boss fights, but there's no Licker or Hunter. There's the Bandersnatch, but like I said, I don't like the Bandersnatch, and I don't think many other people do either. So that doesn't catch on. Character wise, it brings Wesker back, which is huge for the lore of the series, very big. And great moments there. But other than that, you get Chris and Claire, who are popular characters, but I don't think they're quite on Jill or Leon's level, which is why I think this game, also with it not being a numbered title, which confuses people about how it fits into the series, it it, it's it's a competently made game for the most part, with some glaring flaws. Um, that kind of prevent it from rising above. I do think I'm rating it higher than most people would, though. To be fair to it, I think it is better than people give it credit for, but I don't think it's a series grade. So that's fair. Resident Evil Zero is another one of the black sheeps, and I am also going to put this one in A tier, which I know this is commonly, well, this along with like maybe one other game essentially is considered the worst game in the franchise generally, the main series. Um, I just don't agree. I just don't agree. I think Resident Evil Zero is a very good game. Gun to my head, I probably think it's better than Code Veronica too. I really like Code Veronica, but what Resident Evil Zero does is it does something different, and while its designs might be a little grating for people, I have to commend it for trying something, and it works too. So the main criticisms against Resident Evil Zero, right, are no item boxes, which have been a staple of the series in every game before this, and the two two players, well, one player but controlling two characters. So item management is a lot more of a chore in Resident Evil Zero because you have to micromanage your inventory all the time because you can't store anything, but you're allowed to drop things rather than just discarding them. So you kind of make the entire map your item box in a way. But the thing is, if you drop a key item or just something that you're going to need in one area that's not particularly convenient, you have to walk all the way back over there. So it requires much more planning and strategizing than you would um, in any of the other games. However, because you have two characters with separate inventories, um, you essentially have a supersized inventory that kind of moves around. Like, because Rebecca and Steve can be in different, not Steve, sorry, Billy. Rebecca and Billy can be in different areas at once. So, I mean, a lot of players did the thing where they made Rebecca the pack mule and used Billy as their main, you know, shooting and actual action character. I didn't play like this. I tried to keep it a 50-50 split when I played. And it never really was a problem for me. I don't think. I mean, I think the inventory, was a little bit more planning, but I mean, I was happy to do it. I didn't find it too tedious. I didn't find it difficult. I mean, I think the game is more difficult just from a game design standpoint and enemies, but not because of the inventory system. I don't think there were many moments where I was like, darn. I mean, the big one is the hook shot, which is a key item that you need to carry with you and use it deeper into the game, and you might have left it somewhere, which just requires you to run all the way back and get it, which is annoying, but I knew about this beforehand, so I didn't do it. But I can see if you didn't know, then it would be annoying, so I'll concede that. Um, but I mean, other than that, I mean, I think the inventory system works very well and has some advantages over the item box. Like I said, you can drop it anywhere. So, like, even if you have a bunch of stuff and you don't want to run back to an item box because your inventory's full, you can just drop the item and pick up the other item that you need, and it avoids that annoying scenario where there's something that you need, but your inventory's full, so you have to discard something. You don't have to discard it in this game. That's very good. Um, Controlling two players can be kind of weird because, like I said, that's something I think is a little less refined. Um, because you use one stick for one character, one for the other. But you can only kind of like move the other one. You can't really fight with them without switching to them. Now they do have an AI computer controlled thing that will fight, and you can actually choose the kind of tactics that it uses, which is nice. Um, but it's a little clunky. I will. It is a little clunky. I'll say that. Map design is generally okay. The train is really unique and interesting. I like that part of the game. The training center is fine. Doesn't stand out, but there's some cool areas in there. I like the basement where it's like a dungeon kind of thing going on. Um, and there's another lab, which labs are fine. And then sewers is kind of the last one. Like I said, sewers don't do a whole lot for me, or water treatment sort of area. We do get to see the area, the entrance to Nest from Resident Evil 2. That's a fun callback. It's kind of the first real callback that we get. Well, that's not true. We go to the RPD and RE3 Nemesis, which I didn't mention. Um, but it's one of the early callbacks to an earlier Resident Evil game, and that's very fun to see. Um, Enemies are a mixed bag for real here. We've got your zombies, which of course zombies are zombies, but then we've got things like the leechmen, which are the worst enemies in Resident Evil, standard enemies. Extremely tanky, hit very hard. This best avoided. I, I, they're very frustrating. I have nothing good to say about the leechmen. Um, the monkeys, I forget what they're called, but they're very fast and small and a bit annoying. But like I like them design wise. I think they are unique enemies for Resident Evil, and I do like seeing them. So I'm not gonna put those ones down too much. Um, I can't remember the other unique enemies. It's been a minute since I've played, but I think enemy design is definitely a mixed bag because there's some that are good, and then there are the leechmen basically. Um, Boss wise, we get a big scorpion on the train. That's fun. We get another bug centipede in the research center. The big bat. Lots of big animals in this game. Um, there's a prototype tyrant, which is very fun. I like the prototype tyrant. Um, and then the leech queen, which is an interesting final boss. I guess it's sort of gimmicky, but like bosses have never been a strong suit in the series to begin with. Which I think is a discussion for another time, I suppose. But for Resident Evil standards, I think the Leech Queen is fine. Story wise, performance wise, um, so I like this because it expands Umbrella lore a lot. We get to introduce the James Marcus and see how he kind of fell into the whole thing of Umbrella's fall, and we rise and fall, and we also see Wesker and Birkin in this game. Um, which Birkin especially I think is interesting because I think this is like, other than flashbacks, the only real time we get to see Birkin like talking in real time in a game. Wesker is pretty standard for himself. Wesker is Wesker. Um, and Wesker's great, so I'm not complaining about that. But the Birkin I think is very interesting to see here. Seeing the Bravo squad mostly just Enrico, a little bit more fleshed out is pretty cool because he gets 2 lines in the original Resident Evil game. Um, Billy is actually a character I like a lot here. I think Billy's a nice character, and he does have the one game syndrome a lot of characters in Resident Evil tend to have, unfortunately, so I doubt we'll see him ever again. But, his backstory's not super unique or interesting, I guess. But, The character himself is fine. I like him. He feels like a competent person in Resident Evil that isn't annoying or anything like that. I like him. Rebecca's fine. I've never been a huge Rebecca fan in any of the games she appears in, but she's just inoffensive. I don't mind playing as her. Um, so yeah, I mean, a lot of people say the story's bad and there's some retcons, which I mean, if you're worried about retcons, I think you were talking about the wrong series to be interested in. Um, at the end of the day, they just don't bother me too much. So I guess I'm gonna leave it at that. Resident Evil Zero is an excellent game. It's classic Resident Evil with some twists. That didn't bother me. They didn't bother me. If they did, I can understand why you didn't like this game. But they didn't bother me at all, and I thought that everything else was classic, strong Resident Evil design, and that's why it ends up in an A tier for me. Next up, we got Resident Evil 4. Probably the most iconic game in the series. Well, it's up there, I should say. Um, A tier game. I I think this game is very, 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 very good, and I know most people are putting it in their top three. So I know why people are like. I think people are gonna think I put it right next to zero and think that's crazy. I don't think it is, and here's why. Resident Evil 4 is the first over the shoulder title, so we've completely abandoned the fixed camera angle in Resident Evil now. I'm okay with this, by the way. A lot of people are fixed camera angle purists, classic Resident Evil purists, and want to keep that type of style going and are sad that it's gone and don't consider the new Resident Evil games Resident Evil. That's a whole other thing. I'm not one of those people. I think this game is just as Resident Evil as Resident Evil 1, as 2, as 3, as Veronica, as 0. This is all Resident Evil to me. Um, this game is just fun. It's just fun. Um, we are taking on Leon and we feel super empowered. Like, not that we didn't feel super underpowered in the other Resident Evil games. I never thought that was the case. Just that resources were much more constricted. Here, resources are often not as plentiful as you might think. There are a lot more enemies you have to kill in this game, and avoiding them in some scenarios is an option, but more often than not, you're going to have to kill enemies in a way that you didn't necessarily have to in the early games. Um, Inventory system's been redone a little bit, where you carry a lot more stuff and it can actually be upgraded at the merchant. The merchant is a new thing in the game, which is very underutilized, I think, in Resident Evil games. It appears in a few, but I think it should be in almost all of them. Not necessarily a merchant character, but a merchant's a store system. The games that do utilize it, I think, are strong, like this one. Um, so you carry a lot more weapons at once because the item box is done. Everything has to be on you. But Resident Evil 4 is a linear game, so we're following the level structure here. That once you're done with an area, you don't get to go back. You move on. Because it's broken down into chapters, and each chapter is doing a different thing. This is very radically different than how Resident Evil had been up to this point. This isn't a bad thing. It's just a different thing. I think there's a little bit of backtracking too, but it's not heavy at all. Um, we are in Europe. I don't know if it's explicitly stated it'd be Spain, but I mean they speak Spanish, so I'm just gonna say we're in Spain, even though that might not be confirmed. The setting I think is fine. Like level design in the games that aren't this style is much more difficult to talk about because I feel like the level design philosophy is different now. We aren't you know, combing through an area slowly, searching for routing and doing things like we used to. These games pretty much tell you where your next area is to go. So we're just going from point A to point B, trying to get through there as quickly as possible. Not necessarily as quickly as possible, but while killing everything in the way. Um, the puzzles and elements that we used to have aren't as present anymore. So I understand this is sort of coming off as negative because I'm sounds like I'm saying it needs to be more like the old games. It doesn't. It's just this was the transitionary period I think of Resident Evil where it made a big swing, which I appreciate, and it did something different. And I just feel like we hadn't quite perfected it in Resident Evil 4, even though a lot of people would say that they did. I just think it was a great initial attempt. It just needed to be refined a little bit more. That's why it's falling in the excellent tier for me. Um, I mean, I do think it opens quite strongly, right? I think the village is a great area, and we meet um, some characters that are kind of important for the story. We meet Torres Mendez, we meet Ashley Graham, Louis Sarah, and Ada Wong is back from Resident Evil 2. So I mean, characters that I all like. I think they're all good characters. Um, and story wise, this is another self-contained ish type game because it can be played as a direct sequel to Resident Evil 2, but it is kind of its own thing. Leon on a mission in Europe, and there's not too many connections in other games about 4 either. So for lore elements, it does kind of suffer, I think, because of its isolation. Um, and for someone like me, that is kind of important. But we do have some other things that I do like. We get Jack Krauser, who I like as a character and as a villain. I do think it's weird that he's just kind of introduced as like this big important figure in Leon's life. Kind of. I don't know how important he is in Leon's life, but he's someone that the game, wants to build up as like Leon's nemesis. But this is the first time we've met him, so I don't know. It doesn't quite land for me. As cool as the character actually is. I think Osmond Sadler is a very boring main villain. He's just seems to be like religious cult leader that's evil, which I mean, you can break down any villain in the Resident Evil series down to something so unnuanced, I suppose. But like Sadler, other than his video calls with Leon, which are good, um, his video calls with Leon are good, and that's something I like about this game a lot. Is the tone is much more action movie sort of lighthearted banter than some of the previous games. Um, I don't think the performances in the first 3 games are good enough to kind of have some sort of something like this because all the funny moments in the first 3 games are almost always unintentional. The games generally take themselves quite seriously. Resident Evil 4 um, is a little bit more lighthearted. There's banter. Leon banters with Ramon Salazar, who's the midpoint enemy of the game, and Osmond Sadler over his radio call. This is just it's not top tier amazing writing jokes, but they're funny. They give some character to Leon and some character to Sadler and Salazar, who are, we don't see them in person very much in the game, but we do meet them throughout the calls very much until we actually fight them. This, well, I won't talk about that yet. Um, what have I talked about? So gameplay's great. The third person action is, it's now we're still using some sort of tank controls. It's just we're doing it from a third person sort of angle, so you do feel a little strange. We can't move when we shoot yet, but the game it still feels good despite this. We have a large arsenal in this game, much larger than on any of the games before this. So the variety there is great. You can play the game multiple times and try different weapons, and it's definitely given the game a lot more replayability in a way that the other games didn't have. Not to say that the old games aren't replayable, because they are, but there wasn't as much variety in the runs as there is something like Resident Evil 4, and especially all the games beyond Resident Evil 4. You get many more options than you had in the original games. Um, so to summarize Resident Evil 4, amazing revolution that brought the series into the modern day. The only thing I would say against it is that it just, it was the first foray, the first journey into this, and, the polish wasn't quite there yet. I do think it came, though, and I'll talk about that. All right. Next on our list is Resident Evil 4 Remake. So, similar to Resident Evil 1 Remake, I think Resident Evil 4 Remake just kind of takes everything that was good in the first game and makes it better. The game adds a little bit of depth to the combat. We have a parry system. We have uh, well, the parry system's the main thing. I don't know if there's anything else particularly I could say, but it just feels a lot more fluid because now we're not operating under the tank hybrid controls that we were in the original game. We're now fully fluid movement in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Um, it's a pretty faithful remake though. Unlike something like 3 or even 2, the game follows the beats and level design of the original game quite closely, very closely. There are differences, and the changes they make are pretty good. They expand the lake area a little bit. They reconfigure the castle a lot and remove some of the rooms that in the original game I found somewhat annoying, and I think made them a little bit better. Um, and they added an extra fight with Krauser, which is important because I feel like Krauser, like I said, kind of just shows up. So some more time with Krauser is good. They expanded Luis's Sarah's character a little bit more, gave him a little bit more in the story before they kill him off. Um, and what else? Ashley's section is, I think, better. Yeah, her section is definitely better in the new game. So, yeah, a lot of good gameplay improvements there. Game looks beautiful. The only downside I would say to the remake over the original is they got rid of Leon's walkie-talkie video calls with Salazar and Sadler. He still talks to Hunnigan, obviously, which makes sense. And he talks to Luis on the calls now, which I don't think he did in the original game. But he doesn't talk to the enemies in the original game. Now, the tone of this game is a lot more serious than the original one. The banter wouldn't be as appropriate in this game as it was in the original because of how they frame things in the new game. It's a little bit more serious. Not to say that Leon doesn't have any of his one-liners or anything, but generally the game takes itself a little bit more seriously, which I think is fine. But I just think we are missing a little charm there. But everything else about the game, I think, is just a straight improvement. So the quest system. There's like it's not the quest so to say, but it's like little extra things like kill these many things, grab this item or something. Bounties from the merchant that allow you to unlock extra things, which I think is fun. I think that's a nice little touch. I feel like you can backtrack a little bit more in this game too. I don't know if that's actually true or it's just my perception because of these quests, but it was definitely there. I am glad that Resident Evil 4 Remake exists because I was definitely on the fence about a remake of a game that still holds up very well, but they really did just improve it well. So it has me excited if they do decide to remake Resident Evil 5, which I'm generally still against, but I would be pretty optimistic about the quality of that game if it were to be made. Speaking of Resident Evil 5, is an S tier game. Like I said, it's my first Resident Evil game, so there's definitely an amount of nostalgia tied to Resident Evil 5. I'm not going to deny that. But I think Resident Evil 5 kind of takes the things that Resident Evil 4 did and kind of improves them. I think that the setting is better. I think it ties better into Resident Evil lore. I think the tone is more serious, but it fits Chris as a character better because he was always, at least compared to Leon, he wasn't established as this wisecracking one-liner type character, you know. So the seriousness of the narrative does fit. Um, the big thing about this game is the co-op, right? This is the first fully co-op Resident Evil main series title. Um, and man, is this game just straight fun when you play with somebody. That the game is designed around the two players, so I mean they bring the pressure much more with the enemies than they had in the past, and it's just a good game that you can upgrade and trade items with your partner, um, and go through a game together like this, chapter by chapter. It's really fun. Now, a lot of people are gonna say it diminishes the horror. It is too actiony. These are true, but I don't see those as a bad thing. Once again, I don't think Resident Evil is necessarily tied to being this slow, methodical sort of classic horror type, survival horror type game. It can be an action game. I actually would argue that Resident Evil's always been an action game. Horror as well, but I feel like these action elements have been present ever since the first game. Just we're talking about a game that came out in 1996 for the PlayStation 1, where technical limitations at the time definitely played a part into how the game was developed. I think with more resources, I wonder if the original Resident Evil games don't look more like Resident Evil 5 than they do than they did. Um but I mean that's just speculation on my part. I can't confirm that. Um all that to say, basically, I don't think Resident Evil is suffering an identity crisis in our Resident Evil 5. I do think it does suffer an identity crisis pretty soon here, as you'll see, but I don't think Resident Evil 5 is the game. I think Resident Evil 5 is very competently made. I think it's got a great set of gameplay options with weapons, with um, co op. I think the story's good. I think the characters are great. Wesker's final hurrah and the way him and Chris play off of each other in this game is really fantastic. And for a lore nerd like me, this really has a lot to love. Um, I just think it's a great game. I if I have to choose things I don't like about it, let's do that right now, I guess. Um, what don't I like about Resident Evil 5? I suppose I think zombie, well, they're not technically zombies in this game, but zombies with guns is not great. I do think those sections near the end of the game, and these exist in Resident Evil 4 as well, kind of, um, but to a lesser extent. I just, yeah, I don't think zombies with guns are fun. They are typically too strong and not fun um, enemies to go against. And Resident Evil's always been a shooting game, but when it becomes a cover shooter, then that's what I guess I can feel Resident Evil kind of losing its way a little bit because that's not the type of game that these developers are good at making. So when they start delving into that, I start mm, understanding those criticisms. Uh, but this game doesn't go too deep into that. For you know, basically the first 80% of the game, it's really good Resident Evil 4 adjacent gameplay, but with a partner. And that you can't get much better than that to me. Next up, we got Resident Evil Revelations. So, Resident Evil Revelations is a game I played when it first came out on the 3DS when I was much younger, and I liked this game a lot. And if you would have asked me back then, it's easily at least an A tier game. But I recently replayed it this year and found myself really kind of disappointed. Now, it's still a good game, still fun to play. It's, a light Resident Evil 5 type game. No co-op, but you get a partner. It's an AI partner. Um, I don't know how strong that partner is. To be honest, I can't even remember. So, narratively, this game is very bad. Um, you've got Clive R. O'Brien, who's the BSAA head, doing some sort of Batman gambit to try and catch out Morgan Lansdale, who's the main antagonist. Well, him and Jack Norman. And it works. And he loses his job. It's just messy. Even by Resident Evil standards, it's messy. Like, if you wanted me to tell you the story of Revelations, I don't really think I could. Um, and the characters are just kind of boring to annoying. Like, Parker's fine, who's Jill's partner in this game. Um, but you've got Chris's partner Jessica, who is annoying, and then turns out to be the villain, which okay. And then Raymond Vester, who is, I mean, I guess he tries to be something more interesting, and he's certainly more present than the other characters in a way that I find interesting, but he's just not. Keith and I can't remember his name even. It doesn't matter. The two BSA dorks are in bad sections of the game, and they're not interesting characters. The game feels like an arcade game. I don't think this is a bad thing. The way that we upgrade weapons by finding the upgrade parts and then you can add and choose them. I think this is actually the first game that allows us to have sort of add-ons to weapons. Not upgrading weapons necessarily, but add-ons that do different effects, which sort of show up in other games, but it's not a super prominent Resident Evil thing. Um, Not a super prominent Resident Evil thing. So I mean, there's that. What else? Enemy variety is not great. They're all kind of blob monsters, fish-looking things. I just find that boring. The ship is fine. I actually think a ghost ship is a decent setting for a Resident Evil game, but this is a 3DS game, and when played on that hardware and thinking about it that way, it's pretty good. But I just recently played it on PC, and the game's not very pretty. Um, and so I mean, the atmosphere is not great. Um, and then the villains, like I said, Morgan Lansdale and Jack Norman are our two main villains here. I just there's just nothing there, man. I don't. Now, despite everything, I still put this game in good tier. So I mean, and this has been definitely my most negative analysis so far. Um, so why am I even putting it in good tier? Basically, it's because the game's fine. It's a fun game. It's just like I said, Resident Evil style games. It's still fun. It's just I'm comparing it against some powerhouses here. It's still worth a playthrough. Just turn your brain off a little bit. But like I said, the games above it are some of the best games made. So yeah, I I have had a change of heart on Resident Evil Revelations. It's a fine game, but it's certainly not a great game. All right, Resident Evil 6 is next. Resident Evil 6, most people would say is the worst Resident Evil game. I don't agree with that statement. I don't think Resident Evil 6 is the worst Resident Evil game. I don't even think it's a bad Resident Evil game. I think it's a really, 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 really good Resident Evil game. I think Resident Evil 6, following my logic in Resident Evil 5 quite closely, is a fantastic co-op experience, but now we get to do it even more. Um, Four separate campaigns and features a lot of legacy characters and new characters. Um, and we it's it goes a lot of places. Every campaign has their own distinct feel. Um, and I like all of them. I think they're all good campaigns. Leon's a little bit more trying to recreate that Resident Evil 2 survival horror type thing. Chris's campaign leans into the action that's been seen in 4 and 5. Jake's campaign, I guess, is trying to do the stalker thing, which it isn't a real stalker. Then Ada's campaign, um, is probably the weakest one. It feels tacked on, but it's important for story reasons, so that's why I like it a lot. Um, I think Resident Evil 6 strength is also its biggest weakness, though, is that it does a lot. It does too much. You know, it's the longest Resident Evil game by far, and its story kind of suffers from just everything happening all at once. We're juggling a lot of characters, and some that aren't even connected, certainly. Like Piers has nothing to do with Helena, who has nothing to do with Sherry, and all of them are in the same game, taking up the same amount of bandwidth. It's just a lot. It's just a lot. What I think could have made this better, I guess maybe, is like consolidating this somehow. Some people said do one campaign where you switch chapter to chapter, kind of based on the characters, which I don't think would have helped because then you get a weird thing where it doesn't feel like each character gets their moment to breathe. And I think each of these characters deserve their moment to breathe. Jake Mueller is a character that hasn't returned since RE6. I don't know if he's going to come back just because him being so tied to a game that is considered a failure that they might be hesitant to bring him back, even though he's literally Albert Wesker's son. I think that's a huge lore get, especially that he's a good guy. I think that's something that would help the narrative quite a bit. But that's just not the world that we live in, unfortunately. Resident Evil 6 plays great. It feels like Resident Evil 3 where they expanded the abilities of the character and better suited for the high octane things that we're going to face. We can roll and sprint and slide, and the movement abilities are brand new. We can move while we shoot now. There's just so much more added to this, and it's just a delight to play. And once again, this is a co-op game, so you have a partner that you can go through with, and playing this game through with somebody, all the campaigns. I did that through one summer, played through every campaign with somebody. It was so fun. I love Resident Evil 6. It's not Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 is much more clean, much more concise. It's not as good as Resident Evil 4. Like I said, clean and concise. Resident Evil 6 does a lot, but it's all fairly good. It's just a little too much. They gotta trim the fat. Um, and they didn't do that. They tried to have it all. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'll fight anyone that says Resident Evil 6 is a bad game because I just don't believe that. Resident Evil Revelations 2 is our next game. Where do I want to slot Resident Evil Revelations 2? I'll tell you this. I'm gonna put it in the good tier. But I have if they're both in this tier, I would definitely say Revelations 2 is higher than either of these games because I think it does have a much stronger identity and a much stronger attempt at a game going on here. Um, it does the same thing in Revelations as the split campaigns. We're doing Claire and Barry, um, both of who have their own partners, which are not the same as they are in 5 and 6. The partners in this game, this is an asymmetric co-op game, whereas Sheva and whoever your partner is in Resident Evil 6 are the same as the main character, essentially. In Resident Evil 2, you have Moira and Natalia as the co-op friend character, but they don't do combat. They have different abilities. With Moira has a flashlight that can stun enemies and she can find hidden items. Natalia can see through walls. So I can see why this kind of thing might be boring to play as for some people, but it is an interesting twist. It is something new that we've seen. Now, of course, the game does function as a single player game where it controls more like Resident Evil Zero when you swap between the two characters. So that's very interesting. Other than that, it plays very similar to Resident Evil Revelations, which once again, I didn't have a problem with how Resident Evil Revelations played. My problems with that are more narrative and graphically, um, and enemy design too, which I think enemy variety in Resident Evil Revelations 2 is similar to that in of Revelations in that it doesn't have a lot of variety, but I just find the enemies in Resident Evil Revelations 2 more visually appealing than I do the ones in Revelations. The Afflicted, maybe is what they're called. I like them a lot better than the the ooze in Resident Evil Revelations. Also, this game features Alex Wesker as the main antagonist, which is great to see one of the other Wesker children, which are only kind of brought up in files in previous games. To actually see one in action and to see that she's just as bad as the Wesker we all know is nice to see. It's a good protagonist. Um, Other than that, the game does feel a little budget, but you know, no strong set pieces or fights that stand out to me other than like the final boss. Um, so I don't think it's an excellent game. I think it's good, but I do think it's a good improvement over Revelations. What I do hate though is that the game ends on a cliffhanger, and I don't think we're gonna see a not a revelation, a resolution to that, which is bad because I hate when we get cliffhangers. I guess I won't discount the idea of Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Revelations 3, but with so much on their plate, I don't think we're going to get it. So if that's the last Revelations game we got, good effort. I just wish we could see that series continue. Next up, we got Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So this is the game that saved the series. After Resident Evil 6, uh, although it sold well and critically wasn't like abysmal, but the fan base was really feeling disappointed with the direction that the series was heading. Where 4, while massive success and is critically acclaimed, still had the thing where, like I said, it was their first journey outside of their classic style. So the classic fans were like, okay, great game you just made, but where is this going? Then we get 5, which leans even harder in. Still a good game considered by many, but now we're really not even in the same realm as we were in Resident Evil 2. And then Resident Evil 6 comes out, and we just fully lost all pretense that we're still doing the survival horror thing. This is now an action horror shooter, which, once again, in my mind, a good game. But I can understand why people that have been playing since the beginning feel gone and forgotten. Capcom recognizes this. This is where we get Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which a lot of people say is a return to form. I don't think that is. I think it's a reinvention of survival horror because it doesn't really play like the old games. Like, yes, we get our item box and our save rooms back, but other than that, I mean, so the first thing here is that we get first person point of view, which is never been done in the series before, in a mainline game. What it does allow for is the biggest feeling of isolation and fear. Like, even more, I think, than the fixed camera angles. Fixed camera angles are scary because you don't know what's around the corner. Like you can in third person, you can see around where a person wouldn't be able to see. But first person, you're seeing exactly how you are. You won't know if anything's behind you, and you won't know what's around that corner until you turn it. So at that point, you're getting the scariest part of both worlds. And Resident Evil Biohazard really leans into that. So the Baker House is, we can use as a stand-in for the Spencer Mansion. A big house is our main area, and it's filled with the Baker family, who are infected people that are becoming monstrosities. And we got another stalker back in Jack Baker, who was the best stalker since Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now, his portion of the game is rather short, but he makes the most of it, and the fights that we do against him are fantastic. After that, we move on to the guest house or the old house, whatever the game calls it, and we run more into Marguerite Baker, who becomes a monstrosity that might be the scariest thing in any Resident Evil game. Top three at the very least. Um, and then we get in the Lucas Baker's section of the game, which is more of like a Saw inspired thing with traps and challenges. Basically, it leans all into the horror and does different types of horrors that work. Um, this is by far the scariest Resident Evil game to me. Um, it's not even close, really. It's the only one that made me feel uneasy when I was playing it, fighting Marguerite or going to Eveline's room. It was all very scary. So it's a return to form in the sense that we're doing the survival horror thing again. But like I said, gameplay wise, uh, like we got the puzzles back, we got the crowded inventory back. So a lot of similarities, but I would still say a reinvention because of just how different the game plays, even if there's a lot of familiar gameplay elements. Um, and I would say it saved the series. Um, the only thing that I would say I don't like about the game so much is that um, I do think the third act is a little weaker. And in a game that has excellent boss fights, the final boss fight is quite bad. So, I mean, the game does end on a little bit of a whimper compared to how it comes in the first hours. It's just blows you away. Um, but I'm generally okay with games not being able to stick the landing so much, just because I know it's hard to end things. So I'm not gonna hate on the game for not sticking it 100%. This is still one of the best games Resident Evil or in the Resident Evil series, and just in general, like it's a fantastic cinematic game to go through and play. And I am looking forward to trying to do Madhouse difficulty one day because I am very interested in doing that. Resident Evil 7 has a sequel, Resident Evil Village or Resident Evil 8. Um, that's also an S tier game. Um, so it expands a lot on what Resident Evil 8 does, or sorry, Resident Evil 7 does. We're still in a primarily first person game. There is the third person option, but it's not the default or what the game was originally designed around. It's another first person game. Um, Continuing the story of the Winters family. Um, which I guess I didn't talk about it for Resident Evil 7. I'll just talk about it now. I like the Ethan Winters, Mia Winters story. Um, it's Resident Evil at this point had so many characters, and they were all legacy characters. When we do a reboot in 7 and 8, which feels like a new series since we're following brand new characters, it's a risk because we have to see if these characters land with the player audience. I argue that they don't necessarily. Like Ethan Winters is sort of a blank slate sort of character, and that's intentional. And Mia is very divisive. I think she's a good character. Not necessarily a good character in the sense that she's a good guy, like, because she's not, but a character that I think serves the narrative in an interesting way. The Baker family is the real stars of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, and like in that game in Village, the real stars of Resident Evil 7 by 8 Village are the four lords or whatever. Lady Dimitrescu, um, is it Donna? Maybe I can't remember, but the girl with the doll, and then Moreau and Heisenberg, who are full of personality. Every character in Village, the Duke, who is the merchant for this game, also full of personality. And Chris is back in a major way, and he is a bit. We'll talk about that. But the characters and enemies in this game have so much personality, and they kind of have to, right? Especially in 7 and 8, where there aren't a lot of other characters that aren't the main ones in this game. And when your main character doesn't have any sort of personality, which I don't think was been a very big hasn't been a focus in previous Resident Evil games with their main characters, and even less so with Ethan Winters. Um, Having the enemies and other characters in the game stand out is really important, and boy do they in Seven Village. Um, Village has a sort of hub area, um, in between, which is the village, and it connects all the main set piece areas, Lady Demetres's castle and the house for I can't pronounce the name, so I'm not gonna try to, but the dollhouse, I'll just say that. And the other areas, the factory and the stronghold. Um, and the hub in the between the villages is actually little things you could do in there, hunting or searching for treasures. I think that's a really good addition and something that I would like to see more in Resident Evil games. I don't know if we will, but I would like to see that more. I think it adds something. I think it's interesting. Story wise, I think it's pretty straightforward, but a lot of the story does kind of require Chris being kind of stupid, which sucks, but I I can hand wave it. Like it's not the worst thing Resident Evil has done story wise. Um, but everything else I like. It ties into 7 in a way, and also goes back to Umbrella, which I'm just a sucker for anything about Umbrella. Bringing it back to the original story. So story wise, I think it hits the beats. I think the performances are good. I think the game plays great. If Resident Evil 7 is Resident Evil 1, then Village is 4. And I just think it does it a little bit better, honestly. Um, so yeah, Resident Evil 4, one of the best games in the series. Resident Evil Village 4 as well, but Village is what I was talking about. Is one of the best games in the series. All right, now we're on to Resident Evil Requiem. This just came out, and I just finished this game. So, my opinions on this are still fresh and subject to change, but right now I'm feeling that Resident Evil Requiem is an A tier Resident Evil game. So, what Resident Evil Requiem is doing, essentially, it has one campaign split in half, one with Grace Ashcroft and the other with Leon. Um, Grace's campaign, I say campaign like they're separate, they're not. Grace's portions of the campaign are very similar to the gameplay we see in Resident Evil 7. Leon's is very similar to the gameplay that we see in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Both of these, as you can see, are S tier games for me. So obviously, you think he must love this game. I do. I think it's a great game. I think it's an excellent game. My only issue is that and similar to my issues of Resident Evil 6, is trying to do too much. Not as nearly as much to the extent that Resident Evil 6 does, but I feel like this game would have been better served if the campaigns were separated. Because we do have a pacing issue here where we switch back and forth between characters, like a lot in the beginning, but for short periods of time. So it's like Grace, Leon, Grace again, and then we go back to Leon, but now we're stuck on Leon for most of the rest of the game, other than two very short Grace sections. So the pacing's a little weird, where Grace's play is mostly all front loaded, but still peppered in with these Leon segments, and then we get this huge Leon section afterwards. Now all these sections by themselves are great. Don't get me wrong, but it's the pacing. It's just a little jarring. And they, like I said, the problem with consolidating Resident Evil 6, I said, doesn't give the characters time to breathe and do what they need to do. I don't feel like Leon or Grace necessarily get the proper time to breathe in Resident Evil Requiem, especially someone like Leon who has a big arsenal like he did in RE4, but you don't play as him long enough to really feel the effects of that arsenal. By the time you build it, the game's kind of done. Um, Now what we do play is still very good, and there's plenty of fan service in this game for a guy like me that's very interested in the inception and classics of the series. We get a lot of that. So I mean, I was giddy near the end, and the game finishes quite strong, which is interesting. I thought on my first glance that the first half of the game was a little weaker, which is unusual for me in Resident Evil games, where I usually find that they start off very strong and then start a sword to tail off by the end. That wasn't the case here. I thought it got stronger, but after playing through the beginning of the game again, the game is actually just very quality throughout. Um, we got some great classic Resident Evil level design and graces portions of the game, and we get the best, action gameplay we've seen in Leon's portion. So it really is just the best of both worlds. It's just I feel like I value a commitment to something a little bit stronger, which is why I have 4 and 7 in S tier, because they take the one idea and commit hard to it, whereas Requiem tries to have it both ways, and it mostly sticks the landing, and it sticks it very well. But I just don't think it's the pinnacle of what Resident Evil can be. So, and that's fine, even though it's a new release and super hyped, and people are loving it. I just personally think, you know, it's great. Not everything needs to be the best. Not everything's going to be the best. Only one thing can be the best. All right, that's all the main series games. But I did play some of these side games, and I'm gonna rank the ones I did play. I have not played Resident Evil Survivor, or Survivor 2, or Dead Aim. These are all the light gun games. Not too interested in playing those unless someone convinces me otherwise. Then I'd be willing to give them a look, I think. But for now, they're gonna just stay here. Gaiden, once again, another one that I have not really considered looking at, but if anyone thinks I should, maybe I will. Resident Evil Outbreak, I have played. And I don't like Resident Evil Outbreak that much. Now, full disclosure, I did play this game as by myself as a single player, which I know is not really how the game was developed. So I understand I was already playing from a point of a disadvantage, but this is just about my personal enjoyment and the way I played it. I didn't personally enjoy it. Um, the AI in this game is very bad and will often do things um, like that in theory should be good, like helping you advance the puzzles for each scenario. But the game doesn't really tell you that. So I know one of them, I was looking through the hotel and just looking for the next step to do something for such a long time when it turns out my AI partner had already done it. But I had no idea to know that until I eventually tracked him down wherever he was hiding and looked at his inventory. So, you know, it's a game that was designed with multiplayer, and it would have been much better to play multiplayer. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to hate on the game too much for me playing it in a suboptimal way, but this said, like that being said, I didn't like it that much because of that. Now, File 2, I think actually was pretty good because they whatever they did for it, these scenarios were just overall better and more interesting. Like mutated zoo animals, that's always a winner. Um, what else was the other scenarios? Um, Going through the city was one of them. I can't remember the scenarios too much. I just remember having a much easier time with them because the puzzles were more straightforward and it felt more soloable, and that worked for me. Um, oh, the hospital, the abandoned hospital. I remember that one too. The guy with the axe chasing you. Yeah, that was fun. That was fun. I mean, once again, I played single player, so it wasn't the best way to play it, but I had fun with it. I think Outbreak Files 2 was pretty good. for what it was. Like I said, I'd love to play these games with people, that were still possible. But as they were, you know, the single player experiences, I don't necessarily recommend them, but I mean, you might actually like them. I don't know. Umbrella Chronicles. So this is the first rail shooter game. Um, I like the rail shooter gameplay. I think it's fun. I'm not my favorite. It's not my favorite genre or anything, but I played House of the Dead, and this is reminiscent of that, and it's just got Resident Evil lore stacked on top of it. So what's not to like? Um, it adds some retellings of some of the games I liked a lot. Resident Evil 1 and 0. Um, and they added a little bit more to it. I kind of like to think of those as like the real scenarios because at least for Resident Evil 1, it's much closer to what actually happened in the canon of Resident Evil than what actually happens in game because it's both Chris and Jill going through the mansion. But and playing as Wesker and seeing his side of things for a lot of scenarios that we hadn't seen before, that's the lore I'm here for. And Wesker's one of my favorite characters. Um, so yeah, I like Umbrella Chronicles a lot. I just am not a gigantic rail shooter fan. So it's a good game. Not much more than that. Great lore. Dark Side Chronicles is the same. The only thing is I think it plays a little bit worse. They go for a more cinematic bend with it. Um, where like a lot of the times it doesn't even feel like you have to like kill enemies because like when you're trying to shoot them, your character just begins to move on to the next area, and it's like I mean okay, but I don't know. It feels like I'm watching a movie more than I'm playing a game. Now it's a pretty good movie. I like the retellings of two Code Veronica, and then we get the Operation Javier. Those are all good stories, and they're all very good, and I like to play through them. I just kind of wish like it played a little bit more like the Umbrella Chronicles, where I actually felt like I was still playing a game, an arcade game still. Um, so I mean, at the end of the day, I think I actually prefer Umbrella Chronicles, The Dark Side, but both are enjoyable experiences. I recommend them both. Um, Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D is a game I played on my DS a long time ago. I hadn't talked about mercenaries throughout any of these games, but they're a mode. It's a side mode that's present in most of these games, where it's like a time attack sort of thing where you have to kill a lot of enemies and try and get more time and go for a high score. That's fun, and Mercenaries 3D is really fun. It's just the mercenaries, so I mean, a whole game dedicated to a side mode can feel a little content thin, admittedly. But I mean, if you like the mercenaries, and I do, and you like the novelty of playing it on 3DS, which when I was a kid I did, I thought it was a good game. Um, Not a whole lot to add there, but just I like to include it because I played it. Operation Raccoon City I did play. Now, in my heart of hearts, I do want to put it in the good tier because I had fun with Operation Raccoon City and what I played of it. But I know that's not really true. I feel like I like the idea of Operation Raccoon City, but man, playing that game was kind of a slog. The campaign was I can't even. It felt wrong. Like this just, and I know I don't think this was developed in house by Capcom anyways, so I can't really necessarily blame them for its quality. Well, I mean I can, but not for the actual dev work. But it's it doesn't stand to me as one of the stronger side spin-offs in this series, and it was panned quite heavily. But the idea of a what if scenario is still pretty fun. Like, what if Leon or Claire died in Raccoon City? Uh, it's the right type of silly that I think works in the Resident Evil universe. Um, so I mean, and I played a lot of the multiplayer. I thought that was fun. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I'd actually consider Operation Raccoon City a good game. So it could be better. The rest of these games, Umbrella Corps, Resistance, and Reverse, I have not played. So I will not be ranking them. And by all accounts, I don't think they're great games either. So I don't think I'm missing much there. And that is the tier list. I could spend some time here at the end now looking over and seeing if I would change anything tier wise or just reordering within a tier. So starting from the bottom, These games, like I said, perfect order. The good tier, in terms of games, I think I definitely like the Chronicles games a little bit more than the Outbreak Files game. And Revelations is still pretty close to a classic Resident Evil game, so I will keep it there. I think I like Resident Evil 3 better than Revelations, just because even though it's a poor remake, I think the game itself is still more enjoyable to go through than Revelations. Um, and then I think Revelations 2 is pretty good. I think it's definitely the best game in this tier. I think it does a lot right. Ooh, okay, now we get a little bit more difficult. Um, Now we get a little bit more difficult. Um, 4 is probably the best game in this tier. And then probably Requiem. Then probably this. And then this. This rings true to me. I think. Like, is Resident Evil Code Veronica better than 6? Eve. Mm-mm. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. I think Resident Evil 6 is definitely on the weak side of this tier just because its issues are a little bit more pronounced than I think Code Veronica's are. Um, Resident Evil 0 is definitely better than Code Veronica. Yeah, I think so. And Resident Evil is definitely better than Resident Evil 0. I think these newer games are probably better than Resident Evil. Like I said, the existence of remake really kind of pushes it down for me a lot, which I don't think is fair, to be honest, but it's just kind of how I feel. And I'm, if I wanted to just like boot up a game and start playing, I definitely would rather play one of these newer games than I would a classic game, because like I feel like I have to get in the right mindset to play, especially like Resident Evil. Like if we were talking about remake, I can load that up right now, but the original Resident Evil game, I feel like I wouldn't necessarily want to load up over these three games. So I think that's where I'm gonna stick it. Now my S tier, this is where it's gonna get pretty tough. Hmm. Uh, this is tough. This is tough. Should I just leave it as is? I think I like Village a little bit more in 7, so let's do that. I think Village is more fun. Like, if I wanted to load up a game and play right now, just to play something fun, I think I would rather play Village over 7 for sure. Would I rather play Village? I wouldn't play Village over Resident Evil 5, though. Would I play Resident Evil 4 over Resident Evil 5? I don't think I would, to be honest. I don't think I would. I think 5 is a lot easier to jump into. 5 and Nemesis. I don't know. I don't know. Let's say I think I am going to leave it at this. I think this is my order. I think this is the order. Yes. Yes, this is the order. I got it. This is my wait. I'd rather play Mercenaries. Honestly, I'd probably rather play Mercenaries than the shooter games too. I forgot that was there actually. All right. This is it. This is the final tier list. Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, Masterpiece Games. Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Requiem, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil, Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and Resident Evil 6 are excellent. Resident Evil Revelations 2, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil Revelations, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, and Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 are good games in the B tier, and the two games that could be better in the C tier are Resident Evil Outbreak and Resident Evil Raccoon City. I wonder how this goes with the community here. Um, like I said, I know my biggest deviations are going to be Resident Evil 5 being this high, 0 being, Code Veronica being this high, and 6, all these ones being this high. I recognize my gradings are probably a little bit more general or generous than most people's are, but I mean, I just love these games a lot. Um, and I rank them as high as I do because I just think they really are that good. Um, this is one of my favorite series, and I'm finally glad to have played through all these games and have been able to share my thoughts here. A little messy for sure, but I needed to get them out, and here we are. So if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, I wouldn't mind hearing from you. So if you made it this far, I'd be shocked too. So just let me know what you think, if I'm right, if I'm wrong, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.